Hello folks, I've recently made a video centered on parrying and how you would theoretically ease yourself into it, while some decent discussions took place within the comments and some additional feedback touched on that guide not being insightful enough. So we'll consider that a beginner-friendly introduction to parrying, and this guide will be a lot deeper than the first. We're going to get right into it, but I should add that there are minor spoilers in regards to enemy types, maybe pick dose and skills, etc. Nothing story related, but you have been warned. Okay, so first off, we'll break Expedition 33's parrying down into its main principles, which are timing, visual/audio cues, as well as rhythm and familiarity. Starting off with timing, and it's going to be very brief, the moment in which the parry button needs to be pressed is practically the exact moment the enemy's attack connects with your character. This is slightly different to most of the games, as they would typically have us anticipate the attack and parry just before it connects. It is also a tighter window than most games with a parry, and it will probably take some getting used to. There is a tiny bit of wiggle room that feels like it's more forgiving if you press slightly too early, as opposed to slightly too late. These timings should become a lot more manageable once you've identified the visual and audio cues from a variety of different enemies, and what I basically mean by this is, with a wide enough range of practice, you should become more adept at parrying enemy attacks the first time you ever encounter them. There's really not much else to cover without going into visual and audio cues, so that's exactly what we're moving on to. The first thing I'll mention is that the audio cues can be heard a lot better if you turn the music down or off entirely. I know, sacrilege, but additionally, using headphones very much enhances the entire experience and is very helpful for combat in particular. Honestly, the difference between headphones or no headphones and music on or off is practically night and day for parrying. Probably not something you'll need to worry about too much if you're quite solid at parrying already, but definitely worth looking into for others. Now, I've grabbed a decent sample size of different cues we can take a deep dive into and pick apart. Some audio and visual cues are more obvious than others. Some attacks will have just a visual cue, some attacks will have just an audio cue, and others will have both. Coming up first, the following attacks do have an audio cue, but it's very fast and sharp, meaning the second you hear it, you will want to press the parry button. To be quite honest, this audio cue isn't as blatant as some of the others, and I personally had a better time watching for the actual projectile. It is fast, but the moment you see it seems to be a very good timing for the parry. As with this particular attack, you pretty much have the time that the projectile takes to travel from its caster to your character to press the parry button, and the audio cue seems to only play as the projectile is traveling, meaning you'll likely see it quicker than you hear it. This is not consistent across similar attacks from different enemies. Others will have audio cues that play sooner, and others almost don't have audio cues at all. As for example, the next set of attacks here have somewhat worse audio cues than the previous.
I'll do it.
They are still there, but it's almost like the audio ramps up as the projectile gets close, but it does not sync well with the actual parry window. Again, I personally find it easier to parry this attack and similar attacks by watching the actual arc of the projectile. Once I see it's traveled a third or maybe half of its distance, that's when I choose to press the parry button. This is mostly due to the fact that projectiles on this trajectory travel at a set speed, then almost very briefly pause mid-air to then very quickly plummet downwards, meaning you don't really want to parry the moment you see the projectile. Instead, you want to press the parry button as the projectile is going into that brief pause mid-air, all whilst in it. This can be done pretty consistently with most ranged attacks that follow this trajectory. It can't be said for all, but it is a pretty good example. Next, we have a set of attacks that have practically no audio cue whatsoever. I guess we could say that parrying at the end of the enemy's roar would work, but it's very subtle, and as you can see, there is no distinct sound being made. Instead, what we actually have is the enemy glowing a very vibrant white, which intensifies to a max just before the strike, and whilst still somewhat challenging, I did personally find this to be the best cue available. Now, to touch on something that is better for parrying this particular attack, and we will cover this more in depth later on, which is rhythm. This particular attack can be hard to read with both its visual and audio cues. However, it does follow a very basic and strict pattern of exactly 4 beats. What I mean is, there is no variation in speed between attacks, and if you can familiarize yourself with its 1, 2, 3, 4 pattern. Then once you parry the first attack, you can just lock into a rhythm for all of the others. And this one in particular does have one of the most basic patterns possible. Rhythm can be said for every combo within the game if you're willing to sit down and learn them all. And again, we will touch on this later on. Next, we have a very slow 2-hit combo. There are slight visual and audio cues to this attack. Both are about as useful as the other, but I once again personally prefer the visual cue. The audio cue is basically towards the end of the enemy's roar. It's subtle and can be quite hard to place, but the visual cue is the moment the enemy begins to move from their wind-up position. I know that sounds obvious, but the moment you see sudden movement is the point I found best for parrying, and personally seem to catch this particular combo quite consistently. Up next, we have a very quick attack that has another very sharp audio cue and practically no visual cue whatsoever. The arm does extend as the enemy casts, but it's very subtle and the audio cue is a lot more obvious. Again, the audio cue is very sharp, and you do want to press the parry button the second you hear it. This attack in particular is very sudden. There are a fair few like this, and they mostly follow the same principle of having quite a blatant audio cue, but the visual cue will mostly be non-existent, as the travel time for the projectile is likely to be very fast. As our final example, we have the following 3-hit combo.
Brace yourselves.
There is barely an audio cue here, and I once again rely on the visual, which is the sudden movement after the enemy's wind-up. Additionally, the enemy attack pattern follows a distinct 1, 2, no 3, and then 4, which is another good example of using the first visual cue to get into the parry, and then using visual cues and rhythm for the rest. All of this combined with familiarity is ultimately what will bring this all together. Now, in regards to rhythm and familiarity, it's generally quite self-explanatory, and we've touched on it decently enough throughout this guide, but ultimately, enemy combos do follow a pattern, and familiarizing yourself with that pattern through repetition is always going to be required in order to perfect your parrying skills. It's unrealistic to parry every single attack from every new enemy, and thus, you should get into the mindset of parrying not being the be-all and end-all. Levels are set up so you purposely run into the same pool of enemies throughout, and you'll likely be handling them a lot better towards the end of a level compared to when you first entered. This can also be said for the end game too. I found myself slowly getting familiar with more and more enemies, and now I'm a lot more capable of predicting their attacks due to bumping into them here and there, meaning don't let parrying get you down early on. There's a lot to take in, and even if you're struggling to parry, you will get better simply due to rhythm and familiarity. Now, I appreciate you may still struggle with parrying after either of these guides, and ultimately, there is no trick to it outside of everything outlined within these 2 videos. I really can't think of any more advice outside of diving into every single enemy's attack patterns, which isn't something I fancy doing, but the general rule of thumb is, watch for the most obvious visual and or audio cues, find your timings based on these cues, and then learn the enemy's rhythm through familiarity and repetition. That's it for this guide, folks. I do, of course, have a range of guides on the channel, and I am working hard on many more, so do feel free to stop on by and check things out. Otherwise, thanks for watching, folks, and until next time, peace.